The first body was found on a Tuesday. That was the detail that stuck with everyone who worked the case afterward. Not the location, not the method, not the particular horror of what had been done to the victim, but the day, Tuesday, the most ordinary day of the week, the day that exists purely to separate Monday from the middle of things, the day nobody chooses for anything, the day that happens to you rather than the other way around. Her name was Priya Shen. She was 34 years old, a speech therapist at an elementary school, the kind of person described by everyone who knew her as quietly essential, the sort of presence you don't fully register until it is no longer there. She was found in the park behind the community center on Aldous Boulevard, in the city of Brenmoor, on a cold Tuesday morning in November, by a man walking his dog who spent the next 3 years flinching every time the dog pulled toward that particular stretch of path. The forensic investigator who arrived at the scene at 6:48 that morning was a man named Calvin Marsh. He was 47 years old. He had worked forensic investigation in Brenmoor for 19 years. He was considered by his colleagues and by the department and by the prosecutors who relied on his testimony and by the defense attorneys who feared it to be the best in the state at what he did. He was methodical. He was precise. He was, in the particular language that law enforcement uses to describe people it trusts completely, thorough. He crouched beside Priya Shen's body in the gray November morning, and he looked at what had been done to her, and he said quietly to the detective standing behind him, "This is not the first time he has done this." He was right. That was established within 2 weeks, when the department's database search, cross-referenced with Calvin's detailed profile of the method and the staging, produced a match in a city 200 miles north. A woman found 18 months earlier, different name, different life, same careful arrangement of the scene, same absence of evidence, same quality of stillness in the way the body had been left, as though the killer had taken his time not because he was careless, but because he was not afraid. Calvin presented his findings to Detective Supervisor Ines Galvio and her team in a conference room on the 4th floor of the Brenmoor Police Department. He stood at the front of the room with his notes and his photographs and his diagrams, and he walked them through it with the patience of a man who understood that the people in the room needed to arrive at the same conclusions he had reached, and that arriving was different from being told. He said, "We are looking for someone organized, someone who has done this before and expects to do it again, someone who understands forensic investigation, not necessarily from training, possibly from study, from reading, from paying attention, well enough to know what leaves evidence and what doesn't." He said, "This person is not panicking. This person has never panicked." Ines Galvio asked, "What does that tell us?" Calvin said, "It tells us he started a long time before Priya Shen. The task force was assembled in December. By January, they had given the killer a name. The way task forces always gave killers names, not out of respect, but out of necessity, because the human brain requires a handle for a thing before it can think about it clearly. They called him the architect, which Calvin thought was slightly dramatic but said nothing about, because the name had stuck before he could offer an alternative, and he had learned over 19 years that task forces named things quickly and defended their naming choices with the irrational intensity of parents defending baby names. The architect, because of the precision, because of the planning, because of the way each scene had been arranged with the patient deliberateness of someone who understood that space and detail communicated meaning. Calvin understood this better than anyone. He spent January and February building the profile. He worked long hours, longer than anyone else on the task force, long enough that Ines Galvio mentioned it twice, and then stopped mentioning it, because she recognized that some people process difficult cases by working, and Calvin Marsh was one of them. He came in early and stayed late and filled his office with photographs and diagrams and cross-reference timelines, and a particular organized chaos of a mind that was thinking very hard about a very specific problem. His wife, a woman named Dora who taught secondary school mathematics and had been married to Calvin for 21 years, said he was distant. She said this gently, the way you say things to a person you have loved for a long time and know how to read. He said he was sorry. He said it was the case. She said she knew. She said she was there if he needed her. He thanked her. He meant it, that he went back to work. The second victim was found in March. Her name was Yolanda Ferris. She was 41 years old. She had been a nurse at the regional hospital for 12 years. She was found 2 miles from her apartment in a narrow service alley behind a row of commercial buildings on a Wednesday evening. Again, the middle of the week, again, the ordinary day. And this detail was noted in the case file with the specific attention it deserved. The architect chose his days deliberately, and his days were always the days nobody watched. Calvin arrived at the scene at 9:17 p.m. He worked for 4 hours. When he came home at 1:30 in the morning, Dora was asleep. He stood in the kitchen and drank a glass of water and stood at the sink looking at the dark backyard for a long time. Then he washed his hands, thoroughly, carefully, the way he always washed his hands after a scene, and went to bed. He did not sleep. He lay in the dark and thought about Yolanda Ferris and what he had seen in that alley. And he thought about the profile he had been building for 3 months. And he thought about the particular quality of patience that the architect possessed. And he thought, as he often did, in the small hours, in the specific privacy of mind that no one else occupied, about what it felt like to be that patient. He knew what it felt like. He had always known. The investigation deepened through spring. The task force worked leads that went nowhere. A person of interest was identified in April, a man with a history of violence and some forensic knowledge from a brief stint as a medical examiner's assistant, and was investigated for 6 weeks before being cleared. Calvin had told Inez in week 2 that the man was not their suspect. She had asked how he was so certain. He had said the staging was wrong. The man didn't have the right kind of mind for it, the right relationship with detail, the right capacity for restraint. She had asked what the right kind of mind looked like. Calvin had said, like mine, but turned in a different direction. She had looked at him for a moment. He had held the look without discomfort, because he had spent 19 years learning how to hold looks without discomfort, and she had moved on, and the person of interest had been cleared, and the case had continued. In May, the task force got what they thought was a break. A witness, a man who had been walking his dog near the Aldous Boulevard Park in October, weeks before Petra Solano's body was found, came forward to say he had seen someone in the park on multiple evenings who had seemed out of place. Not threatening, he said, not alarming, just present, watching. The man described the figure. Medium height, dark coat, deliberate in his movements, the particular stillness of someone who was comfortable being unnoticed. The task force circulated the description. It produced nothing. Calvin filed the witness statement in the case binder with the others. He did it carefully, as he did everything carefully, making sure the document was correctly dated and cross-referenced. He did not mention that he owned a dark coat or that he had been in the park on those evenings, because there was nothing to mention, because mentioning it would require an explanation, and explanations required context, and context, in his experience, was rarely the thing that helped an investigation. Context was what muddied things. Detail was what clarified. The third victim was found in July. His name was Marco Fenn. He was 29 years old, a graphic designer. The first male victim. The task force read this as escalation. The architect was evolving or growing bolder, or both. Calvin noted in his report that the change in victim profile was consistent with a killer who had reached a level of confidence that allowed him to expand his parameters. He wrote that sentence carefully. He read it back twice. He changed one word. He filed a report on a Thursday afternoon and drove home in the summer evening and sat in his backyard with a glass of water and watched the light change over the fence line and thought about Marco Fenn, who had been 29 years old and had not known, on the last ordinary day of his ordinary life, that he had been noticed. Being noticed was the beginning. Calvin had understood this for a long time. The noticing was the first act, the one that contained everything else, the patience, the planning, the clean and careful staging. You could not do the rest of it without the noticing. Most people never understood this because most people were not capable of the quality of attention that noticing required. Most people looked without seeing. Calvin had always seen. The break in the case came in September, and it came from a direction no one on the task force had anticipated. It came from Calvin's own files. A junior analyst named Priya Shen had been assigned to catalog the case evidence, a tedious process of cross-referencing physical evidence logs with photographic records and witness statements, the kind of work that junior analysts were given because it required patience rather than experience. Priya was 26 years old, thorough, and had the particular quality of people who are new enough to their work that they have not yet learned which details are supposed to matter and which are supposed to be background. This was, as it turned out, an advantage. She found on a Wednesday afternoon in September, sitting at her desk with the case binders stacked around her, a discrepancy so small and so specific that anyone who had learned to see the case a certain way would have looked past it without registering it at all. The evidence log for the Petrosolano scene indicated that a soil sample had been collected from a specific location, a precise GPS coordinate noted in Calvin's original field notes. The laboratory record confirmed the sample had been received. The chain of custody was clean. Everything checked, except for one thing. The GPS coordinate in Calvin's field notes placed a sample collection 0.4 meters outside the actual crime scene perimeter, in an area that had not been flagged as relevant, that lay beyond the boundary tape, that Calvin would have had no professional reason to be standing in at 7:20 in the morning on the day Petrosolano's body was discovered. Priya stared at this for a long time. Then she compared it to the second scene, and the third. In each case, Calvin's field notes contain coordinate references that place him at specific moments during his initial scene assessment, in locations that did not correspond to professional logic of a forensic investigator working a scene, in locations that corresponded, if you laid the notes over the scene maps with sufficient precision, to the positions from which the killer had most likely approached. Not evidence, not proof, not anything she could bring to a supervisor, without it sounding like something she had assembled incorrectly. She checked it 6 times. Then she went to Inés Galvio. Inés Galvio was not a person who arrived at conclusions quickly. She was a person who arrived at them correctly, which was a different skill and took longer. She took Priya's materials, and she sat with them for 2 days, not telling anyone, not building a theory, just sitting with a discrepancy and letting it be a discrepancy until she understood what it was. On the 3rd day, she called in a forensic consultant from outside the department, a woman named Dr. Claire Whitmore, from the state attorney's office, who had no relationship with Calvin Marsh and no reason to look at his work through any lens but a technical one. She gave Dr. Whitmore the field notes and the scene maps and asked her a simple question. Do these coordinates make sense? Dr. Whitmore came back in 4 hours. She said, no. She said, a forensic investigator working the scene would have no reason to be at these positions. These positions make sense from one perspective only, and that is the perspective of someone who was at the scene before it was a crime scene. Someone who knew where to stand because they had stood there before. Inés sat with this for a long time. Then she began pulling everything. What she found, over the following 3 weeks, was not dramatic. There were no confessions in the files, no trophies hidden in evidence lockers, no sudden obvious pattern that made everything clear at once. What there was, instead, was a slow accumulation of the kind of detail that looks like nothing until there's enough of it, and then looks like everything. Calvin's personal vehicle logs, which department investigators were required to maintain for insurance purposes, placed them within a 2-mile radius of each victim's home in the weeks before their deaths. Not suspicious, taken individually. Brenmoor was not a large city. Overlaps happened, but 3 overlaps in 3 different parts of the city in 3 different months, with 3 different victims who had no connection to each other and no connection to Calvin. The GPS coordinate discrepancies, a purchase record, found through a financial subpoena for a specific type of chemical compound, a cleaning agent with a very narrow set of professional applications, none of which were relevant to Calvin's work, all of which were relevant to the elimination of biological trace evidence. A photograph, found in the files of the October witness, the man with the dog, who had described a still figure in the dark coat that the witness had taken on his phone without mentioning it, a habit he had of documenting things that seemed out of place. The photograph was dark and distant and partially obscured by tree branches. The figure in it was difficult to identify with certainty. Dr. Whitmore said, 60 to 70% probability of a match to the subject. Inez said, that's not enough. Dr. Whitmore said, no, but it's a start. They brought Calvin in on a Friday morning. Not an arrest. Not yet. An interview. Routine, they said, a re-examination of certain procedural questions related to evidence logging. Standard review for long-running cases. Calvin agreed without hesitation. He had been interviewed before in cases that had gone to trial, and he understood the process from both sides of the table. He sat down across from Inez and a detective named Ruben Sola, whom he had worked with for 11 years. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at them with the same quality of attentiveness he brought to everything, calm, focused, the complete absence of performance. Inez placed the GPS coordinates in front of him. She said, walk me through these. Calvin looked at them for a long time. He said, I see the discrepancy. Inez said, can you explain it? A long pause, not a nervous pause, not the pause of someone constructing a lie or searching for an exit, a different kind of pause. The pause of someone making a decision about something they had been thinking about for a long time. He said, how much do you have? Inez said, enough. Another pause. He looked at his hands. He looked at the coordinates. He looked at the photograph from the park, which Inez placed on the table without a word. He said, I always wondered what it would look like from the outside. What came out over the following days was not a confession in any theatrical sense. Calvin Marsh did not break down. He did not express remorse in the conventional way. What he did, and it was a detail that stayed with everyone who witnessed it, that appeared in every subsequent account of the case, that Priya Shen would describe 15 years later in an interview as the most unsettling thing she had ever seen, was cooperate, fully, precisely, with the same meticulous thoroughness he had brought to 19 years of forensic investigation. He told them about the first one, not Petra Solano, before her, years before her, in a different city, a case that had never been solved, that no one had thought to connect because no one had been looking for a forensic investigator at the center of it. He told them about the noticing. He explained it calmly, as though briefing a room, as though the information were simply information, the specific quality of attention required, the particular kind of patience, the way the planning felt not like work, but like the only form of clarity he had ever found. He said, I was very good at my job. Ruben Sola said, which job? Calvin looked at him. He said, both of them. There were 9 victims in total, 3 in Brenmoor, 6 in other cities. Over 11 years, in cases that had been worked by other investigators and filed in the unsolved category and left there, waiting. Calvin identified each one with the specificity of a man who had cataloged them carefully. Dates, locations, the particular details that connected them to him and to each other. The department spent weeks reconstructing how it had been possible, how a forensic investigator could have worked his own cases, processed his own scenes, shaped the evidence that investigators and prosecutors and juries had relied on for 19 years. The answer, when they assembled it, was not complicated. He had been better at it than anyone else. He had known what to remove because he had put it there. He had known where to look because he had been there first. He had built profiles that were accurate in every detail except the one detail that mattered. Every profile he had ever constructed of the killer they were looking for had described, with forensic precision, a version of himself in which the thing that drove him had been turned, in the telling, 1 degree to the side of where it actually pointed, close enough to guide the investigation, far enough to never find him. For 11 years, Calvin Marsh had been the best investigator on every case he had ever worked. He had been solving crimes he had committed, and he had been solving them incorrectly, and he had been doing it perfectly. The trial lasted 4 months. Calvin testified calmly. He did not retract his cooperation. He answered every question with the same quality of precision he had always brought to testimony, except that now the testimony was about himself, and the precision was its own form of verdict. Dora Marsh sat through the first 2 weeks of the trial. Then she stopped coming. She moved to another city, and she did not speak publicly about her husband for many years. And when she eventually did, a single interview given carefully 10 years after conviction, she said only this: "I always knew he saw things other people didn't see. I thought that was what made him exceptional. I didn't understand that it was the same thing, that they were not 2 different qualities, that they were one thing, looking in 2 directions at once." She said, "I don't know when it started. I don't think he knew either. I think it was always there, waiting to be one thing or the other. And I think the thing it became was the thing that felt most true to him. I think when he was working a scene, he was genuinely trying to find the answer. And I think when he was the answer, he was genuinely trying not to be found. I think both of those things were real. I think that's the part that I still can't make fit into anything I understand." She said, "He was the best person at his job that I ever saw, and his job was himself. And he was never going to find himself, because you can't find the thing you are while you are still being it." She paused. She said, "I think he knew that. I think that was the point." Calvin Marsh was sentenced to life without parole. He was housed in a facility 300 miles from Brenmoor. He was, by all accounts from the correctional staff who worked with him, a model inmate, patient, cooperative, precise in his habits, careful with his words, observant in the particular way that some people are observant, the way that makes the people around them feel, without being able to say exactly why, that they are being studied. He was denied appeal 3 times. He filed each motion himself from the facility's law library. Each motion was technically correct, meticulously constructed, thorough in its citation of precedent. Each one fell short in one specific area: a procedural gap, a misfiling window, a jurisdictional nuance that undermined the argument precisely where the argument needed to be strongest. Some of the attorneys who reviewed the motions noted this. They noted that it was difficult to tell whether the errors were the product of a man working without legal training or the product of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and had chosen, for reasons that were his own, to get almost all the way there and no further. One attorney, a young woman reviewing the 3rd appeal for a civil liberties organization, wrote in her notes, "I don't think he wants out. I think he is doing what he has always done, getting close enough to show that he could, and stopping just before the point where it would actually work." She wrote, "I think this is the only game left available to him, and I think he is very good at it." She wrote, "I think that is the most frightening thing I have encountered in this case, and this case has not been short of frightening things." She closed the file. She put it in the archive. She went home and she locked her door, and she did not think about Calvin Marsh again for a long time. But she checked her locks twice that night, which she did not usually do, and she left the light on. Priya Shen went on to become one of the leading forensic analysts in the country. She attributed her approach, the willingness to look at familiar things as though she had never seen them before, to one case, early in her career, that had taught her the most important thing she knew about evidence. The person who controls what you see controls what you find. She taught this to every class she ever gave. She always told them to remember where she learned it. She never told them his name.